The church in America has been facing a great deal of change, not only just in the last few weeks, which it has, but even over the past few decades. At Barna, we track metrics regarding people's beliefs and practices, their spiritual faith and religious practices, and what this means in their lives, how they intersect with culture. What I want to share with you today are some broader trends that give us context for understanding this current moment and understanding the way that discipleship can play a role in the future of the church. One of the first indicators is simply church attendance. So we've seen since 1993 that weekly church attendance in America has hovered around the mid-40s for many years, shown a slight increase in the early 2000s, and then faced a really steep decline over the past decade. This is out of an ongoing survey of over 100,000 US adults over the course of 20 years. So this data is very stable, and to see this sort of decline is actually quite dramatic in a lot of demographic and trend data. So that weekly church attendance change is a significant indicator of the state of faith in America. Some people might say, is this due to certain age groups or generations who've not been as engaged with church? But when we look by generation, first elders, boomers, Gen X, and millennials, we see that all of them have shown similar declines in weekly church attendance over the past decade. So it can't really be isolated to one particular group. What are the ways in which people are engaging with faith outside of church? That's something we asked people about recently. We looked at practicing Christians. Those are people who say that their faith is important in their lives and they attend church at least monthly. So they have some church home or church connection. Out of those practicing Christians, half say they occasionally will watch a sermon online, listen to a podcast, read resources, or listen to a sermon on the radio instead of attending church. But almost a quarter of these practicing Christians do that more regularly, perhaps 2 out of 4 Sundays. We do see that there is a difference by generation on this metric. And in particular, when we look at millennials, almost half of them say they often, or about half the time, use some other digital or non-church media resource instead of going to church. This is what we call worship shifting. The good news is that means there's a lot of great content out there to help people grow in their faith. The bad news is, at best, people are missing the value of church and community and how that helps them grow. At worst, they're becoming consumers. What are other metrics that indicate people's engagement with their faith? So we looked at Bible reading, and you can see that weekly Bible reading, at least in the last 7 days, has been relatively steady, again, hovering about a third of Americans, with a little peak that happens here in the mid-2000s, and then a decline again back to the 33% range in the last decade. And when we look more broadly, we do notice that over the last 20 years, there have been an increased number of people who never read the Bible. So sometimes your monthly or weekly Bible readers has been a little more steady, but those people who only occasionally engage with the Bible or who never do it all has grown significantly over the last 20 years. But the most important and concerning trend is the shift away from Christianity. So not only is engagement with faith on a regular basis shifting, but even people's faith identity has changed. This red line is our practicing Christians, those monthly or more churchgoers who've declined. You can see here in the last decade, but they've been to some degree replaced by nominal non-practicing Christians, those who don't go to church often, about a third of the US for a long time, and now 45% of all Americans who still call themselves a Christian but don't really engage. And then finally, the non-Christians of other faiths or just simply none, no religious affiliation at all, has been in the 20% range for a long time and is now up into the 30s. When you look by generation, those younger generations increasingly are made up of people who call themselves nuns, meaning they don't have any sort of faith affiliation at all. So the counterbalance of these trends has been a shift from a predominantly practicing Christian America to a predominantly non-Christian America, even just in the past decade. That's a really dramatic shift in people's beliefs and practices. The church is facing serious disruption. And that was before COVID-19. So these data points were released at the beginning of the year. And then in March of this year, a global pandemic disrupted everything. As we know, churches are still not meeting in person, conferences are still not meeting in person, and the church has had to adjust. So Barna went out to ask pastors what's been happening in the recent weeks and months since this global pandemic broke out. First of all, we asked how they've adapted in terms of services. Are they doing online streaming or recorded services online? And we have seen actually that while initially their attendance was down because they weren't able to engage online, over these weeks into week 4, there's a significant increase in attendance online compared to what it would have been in person prior to this global pandemic. And in fact, now over half of churches are reporting that their attendance is slightly higher or significantly higher. We hear reports from the field of larger churches seeing 2, 3, 4 times as many people online as they would normally have on a Sunday morning. This should be good news, right? Except it might be revealing some different numbers about people's engagement with faith. We're not sure who those people are. So we looked at small groups. Are people engaging with their faith personally and in community? We saw small groups initially had stopped meeting, and so they were trying to get themselves organized. And again, in the most recent 2 weeks, have been meeting via video conference or via social media. So people are engaging in more small communities of faith in encouraging and discipling one another. But we still don't know exactly who's attending online, and we still don't know if those are people who are regular churchgoers who are just taking in as much spiritual content as they can in a moment of need, or if we're actually reaching some people who are hurting and haven't been connected with the church historically. We'll be looking more into that in the coming weeks to try to understand what this change into digital space has meant for many churches. But regardless of what it means, when we ask pastors, it's clear that attendance is not the issue. We often hear pastors talk about managing attendance, managing finances. Those are their felt needs. But the reality is when you ask them what's facing the church, what are the things that the church needs to address in the coming decade, the top of their list has to do with teaching, good biblical, solid teaching. And then shortly thereafter, discipleship models. Most pastors see a need for better models of discipleship. Fully 2/3 of them say that is a top priority for the church in the coming decade. And that's something that digital engagement with faith and attending church online simply can't substitute for. What we learned in this research is that in digital Babylon, faithful, resilient disciples are handcrafted one life at a time.